Hi everyone, this is Mike the Gamer Guy. It only now strikes me that it's been a long time since my last review, but I do hope to remedy that here and moving forward. Today's review in particular should be somewhat interesting, as I'll be trying to answer a question that sort of plagued my discussion of Pirates from the start. Can these games be enjoyed if you have no nostalgia for the original game or property? This only gets more complicated when the game in question is an RPG. Can I truly enjoy Shenzhen Nanjing's Final Fantasy IV, having never played the original and without any real knowledge of the Chinese language? And to answer that question right off the bat, yes, I did enjoy my time with Final Fantasy IV, but it's hard to really recommend it outside of those of us who are interested in these sorts of games. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, the language barrier. It's some kind of understatement to say that the story is important to an RPG. Ultimately, an RPG is its story. It contextualizes and brings meaning to the otherwise extremely mundane work of navigating menus and scrolling through text boxes. One could argue that the only real difference between tax software and an RPG is its story. So, being someone, as I said, who has no idea about the Chinese language, that should kill about 95% of the game for me, right? Well, the thing is, games are not books. Though you certainly are going to miss out on a lot of the nitty-gritty details, there is enough information that is communicated visually and through gameplay to get the basic working idea of who you are, what's happening, and what to do next. Take the game's opening sequence, for example, which sees you on an airship that's being besieged by the guy from Monsters, Inc. I don't need lines of dialogue to figure out that A, I'm a knight, B, the eyeball monsters are bad, and C, that I should kill them with my sword. Now, is this deep, or even all that meaningful? No. Of course not. But the way in which environments, the scenario, and the base level of interactivity that these games provide works to tell a story separate from just simply text is noteworthy, and this game does a decent job with those elements. The feeling of momentum as you travel from place to place is palpable because you never stick around anywhere for too long, and each location is fairly varied visually. Never can I recall getting the feeling that I was walking through the same cave, only on this side of the map, for example. This is mostly thanks to the graphics, which make use of varied palettes and tiles to give each location its own flair. On the whole, the graphics are pretty nice actually, especially the enemy sprites, which makes sense as they come from the official NES titles. It's unfortunate, however, that the battle background is always the same, a problem it shares with Nanjing's Final Fantasy VII port. Another element that I haven't mentioned yet, which can really help sell the emotion of a story, is the music. And wow, I tell you, this music, it's just so mediocre. Almost painfully so. Aside from a decent rendition of the famous Chocobo theme, most of the stuff just doesn't fit and was probably reused from one of the company's many Kung Fu-inspired RPGs, if I could guess anyway. Ultimately, minor for this tone-deaf man, but still worth mentioning. So that brings us to gameplay, of course, and well, it almost seems trivial to describe how an RPG this basic plays. You have a certain amount of life, and so does the enemy. You take turns subtracting from each other's life until one of you is dead. Sure, it's a bit more complicated, there's potions to heal yourself, and magic that varies the amount of damage you can do, but yeah, it's super standard. But as standard as it is, I'd like to point out a few points of interest here, and one massive, unforgivable flaw. For starters, the game does feature a rudimentary summoning feature, it seems, with a limited amount of summons available from the item menu that replenish at the end of each fight. And luckily, it's really easy to use these at will, because after a very slight learning curve, the menus become incredibly easy to navigate, with items sometimes giving helpful clues to their use. For example, displaying the amount of HP a potion can restore, or how much of a particular stat a piece of equipment would give you. This greatly reduces the amount of memorizing you have to do in menus. A more interesting battle mechanic are fights where you're intended to lose in order to progress. There are a few of these throughout the game, and some where you're given an option between playing out the fight or losing on purpose. This is an element that was apparently present in the original game, but is still surprising to see here. It's definitely welcome, as this is another gameplay element that contextualizes the story just a bit. The biggest win for this game in terms of gameplay, though, is simply how playable it is. Most of Shenzhen Nanjing's RPGs, but especially something like the Minish Cap, are horribly broken due to the unfair way enemies level with you. That's not a problem in FF4 though. You can play the game all the way to the end, all the while experiencing a difficulty that is fair while still challenging. Well, That would be the case anyway, if not for the one tragic flaw I alluded to earlier, and that comes with the game's end. The final boss is simply impossible. Even with a substantial amount of leveling up, the final boss is just an impassable wall. While playing through it for the purposes of this review, we spent a total of 6 hours fighting the final boss, and that was only the first attempt. It's a challenge that's completely unreasonable and kills the otherwise brisk momentum of the game. So yes, I'm sorry to say, I did not complete Final Fantasy IV. The amount of time required to level up enough to have a fighting chance is far, far too much of a time sink, even for someone like me who generally enjoys a good grind. Still, I feel like I can speak somewhat to its overall quality. The game is an experience for sure. Playing through a game with such a seemingly high barrier of entry both in terms of my knowledge of the source material and the language is truly unique. A handful of memorable battles, varied environments, and classic enemies gave me a little appreciation for a series that I never really had much attachment to. It's enough to make me want to look into the original Final Fantasy IV, at least for a second. And although the game's closing fight is a giant misstep, the fact that I was able to get that far speaks to the accessibility of what should be an impenetrable game for someone like myself. It's not for everyone, honestly. It's just barely for me. But if you're interested, I think there's a solid chance you'll get something out of it. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope to see you next time. And I'd just like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, some of which you're seeing on the screen right now, who waited far too long for me to finish this video, so I apologize. But now that it's done, we can move on to other projects, and there will be a new poll posted on the Patreon right after this video is uploaded. There's some pretty interesting choices that we have to look at this time, including some really interesting Pokemon ports, so maybe we'll be looking at those next. But there you go. If you want to join in that poll, consider hopping over on Patreon and donating $1. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you later.